As of Omnibus 8.1, it's now possible to create, remove and manage your Web GUI data sources via the GUI using the Data Sources page. This provides a good opportunity to point out some of the properties of a data source that are available to configure here and some of the new capabilities. Let's select an existing data source and open it for display. Looking at the General tab first, we first come to the name field. My comment here is that this name has nothing to do with the name of the object server as defined in the Omnibus interfaces file, although you may want to use the same name to avoid confusion. This is WebGUI's own name for the data source. Once you've set the name here, it's important to be consistent with this data source name across WebGUI. This is foolproof if you're doing your own configuration via the GUI, but be careful of the data source naming conventions if you're manually copying files or uploading them via WAPI. The data source needs to be enabled if you wish WebGUI to attempt to make a connection to the object servers. Looking under the primary object server, a useful new feature is the Test Server Connection button, which allows us to verify immediately that a connection has been configured correctly, or in this case, incorrectly. The Use SSL property, note again that this configures an SSL connection by WebGUI, but the decision here is entirely separate to whether the object server itself runs in secure mode. Let's move over to the Failover tab. Here you can configure a backup object server connection. WebGUI will use this object server to fail over to in the case that the primary object server is unavailable. Note again that WebGUI is not aware of virtual object server pairs configured in your Omnibus interfaces file. When failing over, it will look to this object server configuration which is defined here in the data sources file. Looking below the Failover tab, we have the heartbeat properties. These properties are responsible for the frequency of data source polling. The active heartbeat is the regular poll whilst the primary object server is available. The recovery heartbeat and the recovery backoff multiplier properties work together. These come into operation after a failover to the backup object server has occurred. The backoff multiplier is exponential. Let's do some quick arithmetic to show what this means. If recovery backoff multiplier is set to 0 or to 1, and the recovery heartbeat is set to 10, then WebGUI will poll the primary object server every 10 seconds, whilst failed over to the secondary. This is the default. If, however, the recovery backoff multiplier is set to 2, then the polling will occur first up to 10 seconds, then 20, then 40, then 80, etc., etc. Moving across to the Display Servers tab, this is where you can define any object server that you wish to use in your read cloud. Any object server connections that you define here should be for object servers in the display layer that connects to the primary and backup object servers that you defined earlier. An important point here is the way WebGUI reads from and writes to Omnibus. If no display servers are defined for your data source, then WebGUI will both read from and write to the primary or backup object server. If you have one or more display object servers defined, however, WebGUI will use the display object server that the user session is connected to read from instead. WebGUI will then write back to both the display layer object server and the primary or backup. WebGUI uses a round-robin algorithm to load balance the display layer object servers. This means that WebGUI keeps a record of the most recent display layer object server used for a session, and moves to the next one in the list. When a user logs in and opens an event list, WebGUI will assign this a display layer object server to read from, which will persist for the life of the user session. Any further event lists opened during this session will use the same display layer object server. By contrast, a map will be assigned a new display layer object server each time it is opened. The other properties to draw your attention to on this tab are the minimum and maximum pool sizes. The minimum pool size is the number of connections that WebGUI will establish to the display object server on first connection. Note that this is on a per object server basis. The connection pool settings for the primary and backup object servers are defined in the separate connection pool tab. If WebGUI requires more connection threads to an object server, it will create new ones up to the number configured as the maximum pool size. A minimum of 5 and a maximum of 10 is considered optimal for most installations. Reducing these values creates a greater risk of poor or unstable performance in WebGUI. Increasing these values can sometimes be appropriate for large installations with many concurrent users. It's important to ensure that the connections limit in the object server has sufficient margin to handle an increase. Check with support if you're in any doubt. That's my conclusion to this video. In my next video, I will cover the remaining data source topics of self-monitoring and caching.